The annual Flaxborough Flower Show was, by general consensus, not the sort of occasion to provoke scandal. The hall, a modest brick building with windows steamed from the combined breath of potting soil and human anticipation, smelled faintly of chrysanthemums, beeswax polish, and the faintly unsettling tang of brass. Every year the town's residents observed the same quietly fierce rivalries. Mrs. Pettigrew's dahlias had won first prize for 12 consecutive years. Mr. Trelawney's tomatoes were, by polite agreement, perfectly respectable. And the committee members whispered in corners about the integrity of the judges, as though a conspiracy of blooms might threaten the civic order. Inspector Purbright arrived shortly after 9, not to supervise or inspect, but to enjoy a slow amble through the aisles before the day became overtaken by the aggressive competitiveness of Flaxborough's amateur horticulturists. He noted with habitual detachment the effect of the flower show on human temperament. The elder Miss Harrow's mouth set into a thin line of disapproval as she studied a hybrid rose, and in the other corner young Timothy Fennel, no more than 16, beamed with innocent pride at a pot of marigolds he had grown under protest from his father. All was serene until a sudden commotion at the rear of the hall diverted attention. A small group had gathered around the refreshments table, murmuring in a tone of polite distress that suggested more than spilled tea. Mrs. Dobbins, custodian of the local bakery and purveyor of peculiarly shaped scones, had discovered that a bottle of red wine, intended for the President's luncheon toast, was missing. "Gone," she said with what seemed genuine perplexity, though Purbright could not help noting the ever-so-slight twitch in her left eyelid, a twitch which in his experience often signified a story half told. "Not a drop left. Simply vanished. And it was my vintage, mind. Very expensive. Italian 1932." Mrs. Dobbins' exclamation was followed by a chorus of sympathetic gasps, as though the town had suffered a collective moral injury. It was a minor crime, surely, mere misappropriation of fermented grape juice, but in Flaxborough a small wrong became immediately magnified by gossip. By the time Purbright had moved closer to the group, speculation was well underway. Mr. Trelawney, standing with his hands in the pockets of his linen suit, offered the first public theory. "Probably that boy from the bakery apprentice class, you know the one, hair like spun straw." Miss Harrow, who had not spoken in public since the council meeting of the previous March, lifted a single finger in grave protest. "That is quite unfair. There are other possibilities. Someone may have taken it deliberately, perhaps to influence the judging. You never know what lengths people will go to for a ribbon." Purbright inclined his head slightly, as if acknowledging the remark, though he made no immediate comment. He was always careful to allow the citizens of Flaxborough to present their own narrative first. In the meantime, he observed, his attention fell upon a small, delicate girl standing slightly apart from the gathering, her hands clasped around a paper cup. She had dark, straight hair tied back with a ribbon, and eyes that darted nervously from one adult to another. She was, by appearance, no more than 10, and yet there was a certainty to her movements, a careful deliberation in the tilt of her head that suggested she had noticed more than she should. Purbright approached her politely. "Good morning," he said. "Are you enjoying the show?" The girl looked up, startled, and then nodded quickly. "Yes, sir, very much. The flowers are all very nice." Her voice was soft, almost hesitant, but there was a weight behind the words. "Do you happen to know anything about the missing bottle of wine?" Purbright asked, with the casual curiosity of a man accustomed to finding stories in small details. The girl glanced sideways, her lips pressed into a thin line. Then, with the decisiveness of someone accustomed to making a choice once and for all, she said, I shared some." Purbright's eyebrows lifted imperceptibly. "Shared? With whom?" She swallowed, then whispered, as though revealing a most intimate secret, with Mr. Carrington. The name was familiar. Harold Carrington, the town's elderly historian, known for his meticulous records and habitual solitude. Purbright noted the girl's tone, reverent, almost conspiratorial, but with no trace of fear or guilt. "I see," Purbright said quietly. "And Mr. Carrington? Did he consent?" A faint smile, fleeting as a shadow, crossed her face. He didn't mind. He said it was a very good wine." The simplicity of her confession caused a ripple among the onlookers. Mrs. Dobbins gasped audibly. "My wine, shared with him?" She shook her head, the scandal of it all apparently too much for mere words. Purbright allowed the moment to hang in the air, noting the precise order in which gossip would spread, first astonishment, then indignation, then speculation. By the time the day ended, every flower, every scone, and every ribbon would be viewed through the lens of that tiny, seemingly trivial act. He made a mental note to speak with Mr. Carrington later. For the moment, he returned his attention to the flower arrangements, taking in the subtle deformities of the dahlias, the slight wilting of a particularly ambitious lily, and the tension that vibrated through the gathered townsfolk. Even a small crime in Flaxborough produced consequences far beyond its immediate scope. As he walked past the trophy table, he noticed one peculiar detail. The red ribbon meant for Best in Show had a faint smudge at its corner, barely visible unless one looked closely. The kind of detail that a casual observer might dismiss, yet the sort of detail that often told more about human behavior than any confession ever could. Purbright made a silent note of it. Small, almost absurd details were rarely insignificant. The missing wine, the whispered sharing, and that tiny smudge might or might not be connected, but they were threads he would follow in due course. The town, for now, was already agitated, and its citizens, as always, would talk themselves into theories that made sense only in the polite chaos of Flaxborough life. He sipped the tea that Mrs. Dobbins finally offered him, noting its peculiar bitterness, and smiled faintly. A long day lay ahead, with questions whispered in corners, small observations to be collected, and, as ever, the slow, patient untangling of human nature. And somewhere in the midst of chrysanthemums and gossip, the first quiet ripple of crime had begun to spread. The news of the missing wine and the girl's peculiar confession travelled through Flaxborough with the efficiency of a particularly petty but persistent rumour. By mid-morning, every shop, bakery, and barber's chair had contributed its own interpretation. Mr. Trelawney, who prided himself on impartiality and discretion, was heard to mutter to Mrs. Pettigrew that it was utterly shocking that anyone would encourage a child to partake in alcohol, even under the pretext of social etiquette. Mrs. Pettigrew, for her part, opined, in tones of horror, tinged with jealousy over her floral triumph, that young Timothy Fennel would certainly inherit the girl's taste for scandal if she continued unrestrained. At the post office, Miss Harrow recounted the incident with meticulous attention to detail, adding speculations of her own. Perhaps it was an initiation ritual or an elaborate ruse to distract from the more pressing issue of the missing Best in Show ribbon, which she hinted had already been subtly tampered with. By the time the vicar had been informed, through the medium of a letter hastily scribbled on a serviette and delivered by an officious errand boy, he was convinced that the moral fabric of Flaxborough was under immediate threat. Purbright, observing these developments from his modest office above the town's police station, made no comment. He sipped his tea, noting the way the townspeople's own biases created almost theatrical layers around what, in itself, was a minor incident. It was precisely the multiplicity of interpretations, each one revealing a fragment of character, that he found most illuminating. His first calls were made quietly, one after another, to the parties directly involved. Mr. Carrington predictably received him with calm hospitality, a thin smile on his lips, and a pair of spectacles that seemed to magnify not only his eyes, but the meticulousness with which he regarded the world. "Ah, Inspector Purbright," he said. "I was expecting a call. It seems my taste in wine has caused quite a stir." "Indeed," Purbright said, allowing a gentle pause to accentuate civility. "I understand you shared a small measure with Miss Pritchard?" Carrington nodded, adjusting a small label on a stack of books. "Yes, I suppose I saw no harm. The child is observant, sensible, and, as it happens, quite fond of my notes on local history. One might even say she is receptive." He gave a faint chuckle that did not reach his eyes. Purbright made no further comment. Instead, he moved on to Mrs. Dobbins, who greeted him at the bakery counter with a mixture of indignation and faint hope that he might provide an immediate sense of justice. Her hands were flour-dusted and trembling slightly. "It's simply intolerable, Inspector," she said. "The girl, the wine, and Mr. Carrington of all people. It's not as if he hasn't had everything he could wish for. Why stoop to childish games?" Purbright listened, noting the patterns in her speech, the overemphasis on propriety, the subtle implications of her envy regarding Carrington's quiet respectability. "I see," he said at last. "And did you notice anything unusual around the wine before it disappeared?" Mrs. Dobbins hesitated, glancing at the pastries cooling on the shelves, then added reluctantly, "Well, there was that peculiar remark from Mr. Pomeroy, the council secretary, about how the wine might be appropriately employed elsewhere. I thought it a joke at the time." Purbright filed this away. A trivial remark, perhaps, but it carried the peculiar weight of intention cloaked in civility. By noon, the first threads of suspicion had begun to form. Timothy Fennell, the boy with the marigolds, had been questioned by his father and the local constable, both assuming that youthful mischief was the culprit. The girl, Miss Pritchard, seemed almost proud of her role, though careful never to volunteer more than the bare truth. And Carrington, serene and courteous, remained unruffled, offering to recount his memories of Flaxborough's civic history in exchange for the inspector's patience. As the day unfolded, Purbright observed a further, subtler pattern. The way townspeople positioned themselves during conversations, the slight lean of an ear, the repeated clearing of a throat, the casual dismissal of a subject before lingering just long enough to test reaction. Each gesture, each micro-expression, provided him with insights far beyond the straightforward testimony of witnesses. Toward mid-afternoon, a second incident, though hardly violent, introduced a curious complication. At the rear of the hall, where the refreshments table had been hastily restored, a small vase of carnations, the pride of Mrs. Pettigrew's arrangement, was discovered overturned, water pooling quietly across the polished floor. There were no fingerprints, no sign of struggle, but the vase had been knocked with gentle, deliberate force. Observers speculated wildly. Was it an accident, the work of a clumsy helper, or another layer of mischief connected, perhaps, to the wine incident? Purbright took careful note of the angle at which the vase had fallen, the minute scratches on the table's lacquered surface, and the faint, almost imperceptible smudge of red on one petal. Echoes, he suspected, of the earlier smudge on the best-in-show ribbon. Later, alone in his office, he reflected on the day's events. Flaxborough, in its calm outward demeanour, concealed more than a few petty rivalries, unspoken rules, and latent grievances. A child sharing wine with an elderly historian, a missing bottle of prized vintage, a toppled vase. Trivial perhaps, but sufficient to reveal the subtle choreography of human behaviour. Purbright understood that the investigation would not be about crime in the conventional sense. There would be no dramatic chase, no overt confrontation. Instead, the truth would emerge from observation, from timing, from the polite yet revealing slips that people made when they assumed civility masked scrutiny. He would need to watch, listen, and wait for the right moment when the smallest detail, combined with the patterns of character, pointed unerringly toward the answer. By the time dusk fell over Flaxborough, the flower show had ended, trophies awarded, and pastries packed away. Yet beneath the surface of congratulatory smiles and polite farewells, the ripples of the morning's minor scandal continued. Conversations lingered in doorways, comments were repeated with subtle embellishment, and every citizen carried a version of the day's events tinged by their own perspective. Purbright leaned back in his chair, allowing a faint smile. It was, he reflected, the most satisfying kind of puzzle, small, quietly disruptive, and entirely human. Inspector Purbright began his inquiries the following morning with a deliberate calm that seemed to make the world itself slow down in deference. He knew that Flaxborough's citizens were inclined to volunteer information freely, provided it was delivered to the right ears and in the right tone. Patience, he reflected, was more effective than urgency. Hasty questions were often met with carefully measured silence or politely misleading chatter. His first visit was to Mr. Carrington's residence, a narrow, ivy-clad house at the end of Mill Lane. Carrington greeted him with the same serene hospitality as before, his spectacles perched like a pair of silent observers on the bridge of his nose. "I trust the morning finds you well, Inspector," he said, offering a cup of tea that smelled faintly of bergamot and an almost imperceptible hint of the red wine in question. "Thank you, Mr. Carrington," Purbright replied, seating himself in a chair that had been polished to a high, reflective shine. "I thought it prudent to ask a few questions concerning yesterday's events. Just routine, of course." Carrington nodded, folding his hands neatly in his lap. "Certainly, I understand. It was, a minor incident, though the town appears to have treated it otherwise." Purbright's eyes drifted over the small collection of books and photographs lining the mantelpiece. "When Miss Pritchard shared a small measure of your wine, did she understand what she was drinking?" Carrington considered, then smiled faintly. "I explained that it was a sample, part of social custom, and she seemed to understand. She has an aptitude for subtleties." He gave a small, deliberate pause. "Children, Inspector, can surprise you in their discretion." Purbright made no comment, noting instead the slight crease at the corner of Carrington's left eye, the subtle twitch that had not appeared the day before. It was, he thought, insignificant on its own, yet the mind of an observant detective does not ignore trifles. Next, he called on Mrs. Dobbins at the bakery. She greeted him with flour-dusted hands and a tight-lipped expression that suggested both indignation and anticipation. "Inspector, I hope you will recover what is rightfully mine," she said. "It is not merely a bottle of wine, it is a matter of principle, respect, civility, all of which appears absent." Purbright nodded, making mental notes of the cadence and inflection of her speech. "Of course. I wondered whether you noticed anyone lingering near the refreshments table before the wine was discovered missing." Mrs. Dobbins pursed her lips. "Only that Mr. Pomeroy seemed unusually interested in the proceedings. He stood there, shifting from foot to foot, making some comment about opportune diversions. I thought nothing at the time, of course. But now—" She trailed off, her expression suggestive of an accusation politely restrained. Later, Purbright met with Timothy Fennell, whose pride in his marigolds had yet to diminish. The boy was eager to talk, if only to escape the stern lectures he had received from his father about etiquette and mischief. "I didn't take anything," he declared earnestly. "I only saw her pour some, and I asked if I could have a sip, but she said it wasn't for me. I stayed with the marigolds." Purbright listened, asking few questions, and instead noted the boy's hesitations, the flicker of his gaze toward the corner of the room where his father was stationed. It was all remarkably consistent, yet it confirmed little more than the child's innocence, or his skill at seeming innocent. By mid-afternoon, Purbright had compiled a modest dossier. Mrs. Dobbins, indignant but alert to nuance; Mr. Carrington, calm but subtly guarded; Timothy Fennell, earnest and observant; Mr. Pomeroy, whose brief presence had not escaped attention; and Miss Pritchard, the child who had unwittingly or deliberately become the centre of Flaxborough's minor scandal. Returning to his office, Purbright reflected on the pattern that was emerging. The missing wine itself was trivial. Its significance lay in human behaviour, the lies of omission, the half-truths, the polite concealments that so often betrayed the truest intentions. A detail that initially seemed insignificant nagged at him, the faint smudge on the best-in-show ribbon overlooked by all except himself. It was minor, almost absurd in importance, yet it suggested carelessness somewhere, or a subtle attempt to misdirect attention. Small human imperfections often spoke louder than overt confessions. He spent the remainder of the day making discreet visits, observing interactions in the market square, and noting how conversations changed when certain names were mentioned. Miss Harrow, who fancied herself an authority on moral conduct, now peppered her critiques with references to wine etiquette, while Mr. Trelawney, ever the self-appointed guardian of propriety, remarked upon the potential dangers of children being exposed to adult indulgences. Every remark, every observation was a piece of a larger puzzle. Purbright did not rush. He knew the true art of investigation lay in patience, in allowing the natural rhythms of the town to reveal their secrets. As dusk settled over Flaxborough, the inspector leaned back in his chair and reviewed his notes. There was a pattern of human motives hidden beneath civility, envy, pride, and the desire for control. There were contradictions, minor yet telling, in the accounts of witnesses and participants. Somewhere among them, the explanation for the missing wine and the subtle disturbances that had accompanied it would reveal itself. And when it did, it would be nothing like the town had anticipated. Purbright allowed himself a faint smile, one that did not reach his eyes but hinted at the quiet satisfaction of a man who knew the game he was playing. The day had offered him clues, however subtle. Tomorrow would offer more. And in Flaxborough, as always, the smallest detail was often the most telling. By the morning following his initial inquiries, the atmosphere in Flaxborough had thickened with conjecture. At the market, in the churchyard, and along the pavements leading to the town hall, conversations carried the unmistakable undercurrent of accusation. The missing wine, trivial in essence, had grown in significance through repetition and embellishment. Purbright, as always, observed without interruption, noting the subtle variations in tone and the way individuals adjusted their stories to suit the listener. The constables, less experienced in human nature than in law and procedure, had quickly settled on what seemed a neat conclusion: Mr. Pomeroy, the council secretary. He had lingered near the refreshments table, made an ambiguous remark, and had the air of someone who enjoyed watching minor commotions unfold. To their minds, he was the logical suspect. Purbright called on Mr. Pomeroy shortly thereafter, finding him arranging paperwork at the council office, his hands meticulously straightening the edges of every sheet. "Good morning, Inspector," Pomeroy said, his voice formal and precise. "I understand there is some confusion regarding yesterday's events." "Yes," Purbright replied gently. "It seems the town has taken a particular interest in the missing wine." He allowed a brief pause, letting the observation settle. "I wonder if you could recount your movements yesterday at the flower show, from the time the refreshments were set up until the wine was discovered missing." Pomeroy adjusted his spectacles and began, in a deliberate monotone, a detailed account. Positioning of chairs, the order in which trays had been brought out, a minor exchange with Mrs. Dobbins regarding scones. He emphasized that he had not handled the wine and had in fact been preoccupied with a discussion about floral judging criteria with Miss Harrow. Every movement was accounted for, each explanation precise, down to the exact position of his left hand when he had shifted a tray. Purbright listened attentively, nodding politely, though inwardly noting the subtle signs of nervousness, the faint tremor in Pomeroy's right hand, the slight narrowing of his eyes when asked about Miss Pritchard. "And during the interval when the wine was taken?" he asked softly. "I remained near the front, Inspector. I did not approach the refreshments table until the announcement of its disappearance." Pomeroy's voice was calm, but a faint crease of concern appeared at the corner of his mouth, fleeting and almost imperceptible. Purbright allowed a quiet moment to pass, observing the meticulousness of Pomeroy's speech. There was a consistency to it, certainly, but an unusual rigidity, as though the man had rehearsed the exact narrative to be delivered. Pomeroy, he noted, was a master of civility, yet civility alone could not conceal minor inconsistencies. Satisfied with the initial assessment, Purbright moved on, visiting Mrs. Pettigrew. She was particularly animated, having already constructed an elaborate narrative implicating the council secretary, along with speculative hints of a vendetta against Mrs. Dobbins. Purbright listened, allowing her indignation to fill the room, while quietly noting contradictions in her timeline. She claimed to have been inspecting her dahlias at the exact moment she was, according to others, reprimanding a volunteer about misplaced roses. Such small discrepancies, he thought, were rarely accidental. Returning to the town square, Purbright observed the interactions among the townspeople. Gossip, once released, was almost impossible to retract. He watched as Mr. Trelawney shared a remark with Miss Harrow about the shocking impropriety of children in the presence of wine, while Pomeroy, seated nearby, pretended to focus on his paperwork, yet clearly overheard the conversation. Each person's behavior was a window into motive, restraint, or pretense. By late afternoon, the constables had convened a small meeting in the station, confident that the case was solved. They presented their findings to Purbright with evident pride. "It's obvious, sir," one began, "that Pomeroy had the opportunity, the inclination, and the cunning to take the wine and enjoy the spectacle. The town seems to agree, and all the evidence, all the circumstantial evidence, points toward him." Purbright sipped his tea, slowly, allowing the constable's certainty to rise and fall like a tide. "Indeed," he said softly, "it does appear convenient." He let the word hang, neither confirming nor refuting their conclusion. Convenience, he knew, was a poor measure of truth. Later, alone, Purbright reflected on the day's findings. Pomeroy's demeanor, perfectly measured, suggested careful planning or equally careful performance. Mrs. Pettigrew's indignation was useful in tracing inconsistencies, and the various accounts of those present provided both overlapping and conflicting timelines. Yet no single piece of evidence was conclusive. His attention, as always, returned to the small details: the smudge on the best-in-show ribbon, the toppled vase, and the girl's serene, almost ritualistic sharing of wine with Mr. Carrington. These trivial elements, when assembled in the proper context, would, he suspected, illuminate the true narrative. As night fell, Flaxborough's streets were quiet, and the glow from the flower shop windows cast long shadows across the cobblestones. Purbright, reviewing his notes once more, allowed himself a faint smile. The case, he reflected, was far from resolved. What the town saw as a neat and tidy conclusion, the council secretary as the obvious culprit, was only the surface. Beneath it lay the subtler truths of human behaviour, the small perturbations of routine that often revealed far more than any confession. And somewhere, in the gentle rhythm of Flaxborough life, the smallest of clues awaited his attention, ready to transform the trivial into revelation. The following morning, Flaxborough awoke to a subtle but unmistakable tension. The flower show had ended, yet the undercurrent of yesterday's minor scandal persisted like a shadow clinging to a bright summer day. Conversations in the market were quieter, measured, as if the townspeople were testing the social climate before speaking. Purbright, ever attentive, walked along the pavements with the air of casual observation, noting the shifts in expression and posture that might reveal more than words ever could. It was Mrs. Pettigrew who first drew his attention to an apparently trivial detail, one that to anyone else would have seemed insignificant. She was fussing with her garden gloves at the market stall, her eyes darting from vendor to vendor. "Inspector," she said, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper, "I noticed something yesterday. Something odd, really. On the ribbon for Best in Show." Purbright raised an eyebrow. "Yes?" "There was a smudge, very small. Red, like—" She hesitated as if reluctant to finish. "Like wine, but that's absurd, isn't it? One would hardly expect wine to touch the ribbon." Purbright nodded slowly, allowing the point to settle. He had already observed the smudge, and its presence had intrigued him precisely because it seemed trivial, too small to matter, yet too deliberate to ignore. Human behaviour, he reflected, often revealed itself in the smallest inconsistencies. He spent the morning visiting various homes, making quiet inquiries, and observing town interactions. The girl, Miss Pritchard, was now seen frequently near Mr. Carrington, but always with an air of careful propriety, as though she were performing an act that had been rehearsed in miniature. Carrington himself remained imperturbable, yet the crease at the corner of his eye, the one Purbright had noticed earlier, flickered briefly whenever conversation touched on wine or etiquette. At the post office, Miss Harrow expressed her persistent concern over the propriety of children and adults mingling in morally ambiguous contexts. "It is one thing to observe tradition, Inspector," she said, "but quite another to condone indulgence. One must consider the precedent being set." Purbright made no response, noting only the cadence of her speech and the self-righteous satisfaction she derived from expressing concern. By early afternoon, Purbright had returned to the flower show hall. The trophies had been removed, but the table where the wine had vanished remained in place. He observed the scratches in the varnish of the table, the faint smudge on a now empty cloth napkin, and the delicate traces of water near the vase that had toppled. Each minor irregularity suggested a sequence of events that could be reconstructed through careful attention. He paused near the trophy table, allowing the shadows of the afternoon to play across the hall. The minor smudge on the ribbon, the toppled vase, and the slightly misplaced cup that the girl had held. All of these trivialities, when assembled, formed a pattern. Not one of obvious crime, but of human behaviour, choices, hesitations, small indulgences that revealed character as surely as any confession. Later, as he walked through the market square, he observed Mr. Pomeroy seated on a bench pretending to read the local gazette, though the paper's pages were largely ignored. Purbright noted the way Pomeroy's fingers twitched slightly when he thought himself unobserved, a minor sign of impatience or guilt, or perhaps merely discomfort. Such subtleties, when considered alongside Mrs. Pettigrew's observations, suggested an intricate choreography among the townspeople, each acting in accordance with personal motives, yet entirely unaware of the larger picture. By evening, Purbright had begun to form a quiet theory. The missing wine, the toppled vase, the smudged ribbon, all were connected, yet not in any conventional sense of wrongdoing. There was no theft in the malicious sense, no deliberate sabotage. Instead, there was a subtle play of influence, an interaction of pride, curiosity, and etiquette. And, he suspected, the smallest of actors, the child, might have been the most telling participant of all. He returned to his office, reviewing his notes in the fading light. The town's citizens were convinced that Pomeroy was the culprit, yet Purbright remained unconvinced. Opportunity alone was not enough. Motive had to be considered alongside manner, timing, and social expectation. He reflected on the human propensity to conceal intention behind civility and on the gentle patterns of observation and reaction that were often more revealing than words. As night fell, the streets of Flaxborough were quiet once again. The shops were shuttered, the market square empty, and the shadows long and unbroken. Purbright sat at his desk, tea cooling at his side, pen poised above the paper. The trivial, almost absurd details of the day, the smudge, the toppled vase, the girl's precise comportment, would, he was certain, guide him toward clarity. Patience, as always, was essential. The town itself would provide the final piece of the puzzle, in time. And somewhere within the small town's careful routines and understated rivalries, the truth lay waiting, poised, to reveal itself to the observer who had learned to watch without judgment and to listen without interruption. By midweek, Inspector Purbright had begun to extend his inquiries beyond the immediate circle of those directly involved in the flower show. Flaxborough, he reflected, was a town that thrived on minor rivalries and concealed grievances. To understand one event fully, one had to observe its ripples throughout the community. He first visited the vicar, who, in the cool serenity of the rectory, expressed concern over the moral tone of the town. "Inspector," the vicar said, his voice measured, "I do not wish to pry, but there is a certain impression that even children are being drawn into inappropriate indulgences. One must consider not only what has happened, but what example it sets." Purbright, noting the earnestness behind the concern, smiled politely. The vicar's perspective, though moralistic, provided useful insight into the town's expectations and the subtle pressures that governed behaviour. Next, Purbright called on Mrs. Greaves, proprietor of the tea shop near the market. She was known for her discreet knowledge of everyone who entered her establishment. "Now, Inspector," she said, pouring tea with a precision that suggested habit and authority, "I saw young Miss Pritchard slip past Mr. Carrington, cup in hand, and she didn't spill a drop. Remarkable control, that child. And Mr. Carrington, bless him, he didn't scold her, just watched. Odd, isn't it?" "Very odd." Purbright made a quiet note. Oddness, after all, was often the first hint of intention. It was rarely coincidental. Later, at the market, he observed interactions among townsfolk that further complicated the picture. Mr. Trelawney and Miss Harrow, both, previously vocal on the matter of propriety, whispered to each other, throwing subtle glances toward Mrs. Pettigrew, who was busy arranging her stall. The interplay of observation and reaction revealed alliances and minor jealousies, each a thread in the complex tapestry of Flaxborough society. He also noted the behaviour of the Fennells. Timothy, ever eager to prove his innocence, shadowed his father with a mixture of anxiety and pride. Mr. Fennell, for his part, seemed to regard the entire wine incident as a moral failing to be corrected through lectures rather than investigation. The differing attitudes within a single household, Purbright reflected, often mirrored the wider contradictions of the town itself. By late afternoon, a minor yet significant discovery occurred. While reviewing the flower show hall, Purbright noticed a folded scrap of paper tucked behind the base of a trophy stand. It bore a hastily scribbled note, "For tonight only, careful with what is observed." The handwriting was uncertain, the ink smudged. It was, he thought, a warning, subtle and almost playful, yet it suggested a deliberate awareness of scrutiny. He also revisited Mr. Carrington, who received him with polite curiosity. "Inspector," he said, adjusting the angle of his spectacles, "I trust your inquiries are proceeding satisfactorily. I must admit the town seems more agitated than the matter warrants." "Yes," Purbright said, studying the room. "Sometimes it is the smallest details that elicit the most attention." He allowed a pause, noting the careful arrangement of books, the precise alignment of objects, and the slight, almost imperceptible tremor when Carrington's gaze fell on the child's cup from the previous day. Purbright's attention then turned to the constables. Their initial certainty regarding Mr. Pomeroy had begun to falter in light of the broader perspectives he had gathered. There were inconsistencies in witness accounts, minor yet telling, and subtle behaviors that suggested motives not immediately apparent. He encouraged the constables to continue collecting statements, though he restrained them from jumping to conclusions. By evening, the threads of the case had broadened. The missing wine was no longer an isolated incident. It was entwined with social dynamics, petty rivalries, and a series of carefully concealed interactions. Every character he had observed, Carrington, the child, Pomeroy, Mrs. Pettigrew, the Fennels, and even the vicar, offered a small, telling insight into human behavior, none of which was immediately obvious to the casual observer. Purbright reflected on the subtle interplay of civility and concealment that defined Flaxborough. The town's routine, outwardly tranquil, concealed layers of intention and reaction. Every smile, every polite correction, every whispered remark was a potential clue. And within that matrix he was confident that the missing wine, the toppled vase, and the smudged ribbon could be understood, not through force or confrontation, but through careful, deliberate observation. As darkness settled over Flaxborough, Purbright prepared his notes for the following day. There were questions yet to ask, small tests to observe, and a final clarity that could only emerge when the town's own subtleties revealed the truth. The investigation, he understood, would unfold slowly as the smallest details accumulated and aligned with the patterns of human behavior. And somewhere, in the quiet corners and the polite facades of Flaxborough, the answer waited, patient, elusive, and entirely human. Flaxborough woke the next morning to an unexpected disruption, minor by outward appearances, but significant in the subtle currents of town life. The postmistress, Mrs. Clavering, had discovered that several letters intended for local dignitaries and business owners had been misplaced. They were not lost entirely, but shuffled and slightly creased, as though someone had handled them with careless attention. The town was instantly abuzz. While the letters contained nothing scandalous, most were routine invitations and bills, their misplacement was interpreted as a signal of disorder, an affront to the meticulous civility upon which Flaxborough prided itself. Purbright, hearing the news over a quiet morning cup of tea, allowed himself a small smile. Trivial incidents often yielded the richest observations. He strolled through the market, noting the way citizens murmured behind handkerchiefs or cast furtive glances toward Mrs. Clavering's shop. Each reaction, each whisper, carried a subtle cue, revealing more about character than any document or confession could. He paused outside the tea shop, where Mrs. Greaves polished the counter with obsessive care. "Inspector," she said, nodding toward the post office. "It's a terrible thing. Letters are misplaced, yes, but the timing, it coincides with all the fuss about the flower show wine. One can't help but think there's a connection." Purbright inclined his head. "Coincidence is a persistent companion, Mrs. Greaves, but connections are often hidden in the smallest details." He watched her eyes flicker toward the post office, noting both curiosity and subtle anxiety. Even minor disruption revealed layers of social hierarchy and personal investment. Inside the post office, he spoke with Mrs. Clavering herself. Her hands were busy, though she paused to gesture toward the disordered letters. "It is quite unsettling, Inspector. The letters were stacked neatly, as always, and then chaos. I do not know whether to blame clumsiness or something more deliberate." Purbright examined the envelopes carefully, noting minor fingerprints that did not belong to the postmistress, slight indentations that suggested a hurried glance at the addresses, and, most tellingly, one envelope partially opened and then resealed. A trivial action, almost imperceptible, but in combination with the flower show incidents, it suggested an awareness of observation and possibly a deliberate test of attention. Later, he revisited Mr. Carrington, whose calm exterior had been punctuated the previous day by fleeting signs of unease. "You seem remarkably composed," Purbright remarked, noting the faintest crease at the corner of Carrington's eye as he handled a carefully catalogued ledger. Carrington smiled faintly. "One must maintain composure, Inspector. Even the smallest ripple can unsettle a town like Flaxborough." His voice was courteous, yet there was an almost imperceptible tension in his hands as he adjusted a stack of books. Purbright left with a sense that the letter's disruption was a carefully orchestrated nudge meant to test reactions. It aligned in a curious way with the trivial but telling details of the flower show, the missing wine, the smudged ribbon, the toppled vase, and the girl's precise, deliberate sharing of her cup. All pointed to a subtle choreography, a sequence of human interactions that could only be understood through patient observation. As the day unfolded, Purbright expanded his inquiries further, visiting Timothy Fennell, whose father insisted on moral instruction alongside testimony. Timothy described seeing the letters being handled by a figure moving cautiously through the post office, though he admitted he had been preoccupied with arranging his marigolds for a second viewing. The boy's description, carefully qualified and honest, provided only partial clarity, but it reinforced the presence of deliberate intent behind otherwise trivial acts. By evening, Purbright compiled his observations. There was now a series of minor incidents: the missing wine, the toppled vase, the smudged ribbon, and the displaced letters. Each alone was trivial, almost absurdly so. Together they formed a pattern of deliberate attention testing, subtle manipulation, and concealed motives. No crime in the traditional sense had occurred, yet human behavior, the choices, hesitations, and concealments, had been revealed in full. Sitting at his desk, he reflected on the day. Flaxborough's residents were now fully engaged in conjecture, their social assumptions sharpening and their personal biases deepening. He had observed the interplay of civility, curiosity, and control, the way small disruptions magnified perceptions of propriety and impropriety alike. Purbright, as always, remained patient. The truth would not emerge from hasty accusations or superficial scrutiny. It would reveal itself through observation, timing, and the quiet, often unnoticed, details that spoke volumes. He reviewed the minor clues once more: the smudged ribbon, the toppled vase, the girl's conduct, the letters, each a subtle signal, a small perturbation in the orderly rhythm of Flaxborough life. As night settled over the town, Purbright closed his notebook, allowing himself a brief, contemplative smile. The pieces were aligning, ever so slowly, and when the final truth emerged, it would do so not with clamour or confrontation, but with the quiet inevitability that comes from understanding human nature in its smallest, most revealing gestures. The following morning, Purbright arrived at the station before the town had fully stirred. The early light, streaming through the tall windows, illuminated the stacks of paperwork and the neat row of ink-stained pens along his desk. He sipped his tea slowly, allowing himself the rare luxury of reflection before resuming the outward-facing work of inquiries. He considered the events that had unfolded over the past week: the missing wine, the toppled vase, the smudged ribbon, the misplaced letters. Each minor incident, trivial in isolation, collectively revealed more than any direct confession could. What struck him most was the consistency of human behavior beneath civility, the careful hedging of speech, the small gestures of concealment, the subtle tests of observation that townspeople administered upon one another, often unconsciously. Purbright allowed his mind to wander gently through each character. Mr. Carrington, outwardly calm and courteous, displayed a faint tension in the presence of the child, a small wrinkle at the corner of his eye whenever the subject of wine or etiquette arose. Mrs. Pettigrew, sharp-tongued and indignant, could not resist embellishing minor details, revealing contradictions that would have gone unnoticed without careful listening. Pomeroy remained the initial suspect in the town's eyes, yet his meticulous demeanour, combined with slight, almost imperceptible signs of discomfort, suggested something far subtler than outright malfeasance. The child, Miss Pritchard, was perhaps the most fascinating of all. Her conduct was deliberate, precise, and entirely self-contained. She had shared wine with Carrington in a manner that seemed almost ritualistic, yet she revealed nothing more than the bare truth. Observing her, Purbright noted that innocence and discretion often coexisted in unexpected ways, and that the smallest actors sometimes orchestrated the largest revelations. He also reflected on the social architecture of Flaxborough itself. A town outwardly placid, orderly, and polite, it concealed layers of ambition, rivalry, and hidden motives. The flower show, a trivial civic occasion, had acted as a catalyst, bringing to the surface subtle frictions and private indulgences. Citizens engaged in a delicate dance of observation and concealment, their public personas masking private calculations. Even minor incidents, Purbright understood, could illuminate the intricate web of social expectation, pride, and envy that underpinned everyday life. In this quiet hour, he also contemplated the role of patience. Investigation was rarely a matter of force. It was instead a process of watching, listening, and allowing events to unfold while recording the faintest signs. Timing was essential. A comment, a gesture, a hesitated glance. These were the things that revealed truth, often long before words did. He recalled the smudged ribbon, the toppled vase, and the letters shuffled in the post office. Each had seemed inconsequential at the moment, yet, together, they suggested a deliberate interplay of action and reaction. Someone was testing boundaries, observing behavior, perhaps even prompting certain responses. The identity of that individual and the motives behind their acts remained obscured, but the pattern was emerging. Purbright sipped the last of his tea and set the cup down carefully. There was a rhythm to human behavior, a predictability beneath apparent chaos, and he had begun to discern it. He reflected on human nature more broadly, the desire for recognition, the subtle exertion of influence, and the intricate negotiations of civility that governed every interaction. In Flaxborough, these forces were magnified in miniature, and in observing them, he had come closer to understanding the truth behind the minor disruptions. By late morning, he prepared to resume fieldwork. He would ask further questions, stage minor observations, and continue to trace the delicate patterns of behavior. Yet this period of private reflection had been essential. It reinforced his understanding that the resolution would not arise from overt investigation alone, but from a careful reading of motives, habits, and subtle signs. The town continued its measured routine outside his office window, unaware that the pattern was slowly revealing itself to a single, patient observer. Purbright felt a quiet anticipation. The culmination of these minor incidents, trivial to the casual eye, would soon illuminate the truth in a manner that was both calm and inevitable. As he gathered his notes and prepared to leave, he allowed himself a faint smile. The pieces were aligning, quietly, and the final revelation would unfold not in spectacle, but in the calm precision of insight. By mid-morning, Flaxborough hummed with the quiet rhythms of its routines, yet a subtle tension lingered, perceptible only to the trained observer. Inspector Purbright moved through the streets with deliberate casualness, pausing to exchange brief pleasantries, all the while cataloguing the behaviours and expressions of the townspeople. He had spent days absorbing the interplay of civility, rivalry, and curiosity, and now he sought a means to observe reactions more directly. His plan was simple, a polite but deliberate test, designed to provoke a small, telling response without causing alarm or offence. He began at the tea shop, where Mrs. Greaves served tea with customary precision. "Good morning, Inspector," she said. "I trust your investigations continue smoothly?" "Quite," Purbright replied, allowing a faintly inquisitive tone to colour his words. "I am curious, Mrs. Greaves. If one were to observe subtle signs of mischief among adults and children alike, what might one notice?" Her eyebrows rose imperceptibly. "Mischief, Inspector, in Flaxborough." She laughed lightly, but her fingers lingered on the cup for a moment longer than necessary. Purbright noted the subtle tightening of her jaw, the way her eyes flicked toward the door as if expecting someone to enter. From there he wandered to the square, engaging Mr. Trelawney and Miss Harrow in casual conversation about garden displays and the season's flowers. Each remark was designed to reference indirectly the flower show incidents without naming them explicitly. It is curious how even the most meticulous arrangements can suffer slight disturbances, he observed, letting the words hang in the air. Miss Harrow adjusted her hat, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Yes, Inspector," she said, "though one must hope such matters are minor and unintentional." Her tone, formal yet taut, suggested an underlying anxiety about appearances, a concern that Purbright noted with interest. Finally, he returned to the flower show hall in the late afternoon, inviting Mrs. Pettigrew and Mr. Pomeroy under the pretext of reviewing arrangements for the following year. The room, bathed in soft light, was arranged precisely as it had been days earlier, though the trophies and ribbons were absent. Purbright spoke gently, his voice calm and measured. "It is remarkable, the precision of some actions and the inadvertent signs of others, a small mark on a ribbon, a misplaced letter. Sometimes these are the most telling." Pomeroy shifted in his seat, glancing at the empty table. "Inspector, I do not understand. Are you implying someone acted improperly?" "I am suggesting only that certain behaviours can be observed," Purbright replied, his gaze steady. "Sometimes, in trying to maintain perfect appearances, one leaves traces that reveal far more than intended." Mrs. Pettigrew, ever eager to assert her knowledge, leaned forward. "Oh, I suspected it all along. People cannot resist such temptations." Her voice was bright with the satisfaction of moral certainty, though Purbright noted the slight exaggeration in her gestures, a hint of self-consciousness beneath her certainty. As the conversation continued, he introduced a small, deliberate ambiguity. He mentioned casually that the smudged ribbon had been examined closely and that subtle patterns of movement in the hall had been noted. Neither Pomeroy nor Pettigrew reacted overtly, but their eyes betrayed minute flickers, micro-expressions that hinted at awareness, perhaps even anxiety. By the end of the afternoon, Purbright had gathered more than words could reveal. The polite discomfort, the small hesitations, the fleeting gestures, all were data points. He had planted a seed of observation, a gentle prod that allowed him to see who among them responded with care, who with concealment, and who, with inadvertent revelation, walking back through the quiet streets of Flaxborough as dusk approached Purbright, reflected on the efficacy of his method. The test had been subtle, civil, and entirely indirect, yet it had produced the smallest, most telling signs of human nature. Opportunity and motive alone could not explain these behaviors. It was the interaction between civility and curiosity, between observation and reaction, that would illuminate the truth. And in that calm, methodical patience, he felt the threads beginning to converge. The minor incidents, the wine, the vase, the ribbon, the letters, were no longer isolated curiosities. They were components of a single, intricate pattern waiting for the final, quiet moment of revelation. The morning air in Flaxborough carried the usual scent of freshly baked bread and damp cobblestones, but for those who knew how to observe, it carried an undercurrent of expectancy. Inspector Purbright arrived at the flower show hall early, finding the polished floors empty, save for the faint reflection of sunlight on the windows. Today, he reflected, the story would reach its calm yet inevitable conclusion. He had summoned the principal figures under the pretext of reviewing arrangements for the next flower show. Mr. Carrington arrived with his customary composure, adjusting his spectacles as if to present the very embodiment of civility. Mrs. Pettigrew followed, prim and alert, while Pomeroy, ever precise in his movements, entered last, his face carefully neutral. Miss Pritchard, escorted by her mother, waited quietly in the corner, her hands folded neatly, eyes observing everything with calm attentiveness. Purbright stood at the centre of the hall, hands clasped behind his back, his expression serene. "Thank you all for attending," he began. "I thought it prudent to discuss the minor disturbances that accompanied our last flower show, for clarity and understanding. These incidents, the missing wine, the toppled vase, the smudged ribbon, and the shuffled letters, though trivial, have revealed far more about human behaviour than the town might assume." He paused, letting the words settle. Each individual present was attentive, measured, yet subtly tense, aware that the inspector's observations had been extensive and deliberate. "First," Purbright continued, "the wine. It was, as many suspected, shared by Miss Pritchard, but not in the manner one might imagine." The child poured with care and courtesy, offering only what was socially appropriate. She did not taste it herself. Her actions were guided by a desire to follow social etiquette rather than curiosity or mischief. A small murmur of acknowledgment passed among the adults, and Purbright nodded gently. The vase toppled through simple accident, and the smudge on the ribbon arose from the same event. Yet these incidents drew attention precisely because of the care taken in the presentation of the awards. Humans are naturally alert to deviations from perfection, however minor. He then turned his attention to the letters. The shuffled correspondence in the post office was not the work of malicious intent. Rather, it was an inadvertent act by Mr. Carrington, who, while assisting with the flower show arrangements, inadvertently displaced them while transporting other items. The impression of deliberate disturbance arose from the natural reactions of the townspeople, whose attentiveness to propriety magnifies even minor errors. Carrington inclined his head, expression calm, though a faint colour had risen to his cheeks. "Inspector, No need for apology," Purbright interrupted with a faint smile. "Your actions, entirely human, simply provided a means to observe the community's response to minor disruptions. In a sense, Flaxborough has conducted its own test of civility, curiosity, and restraint." Pomeroy, who had remained rigidly composed, allowed a faint exhalation, as though realizing the tension he had felt was unnecessary. Mrs. Pettigrew, ever eager to assert moral judgment, looked momentarily deflated, as her anticipations of scandal were gently but firmly corrected. Purbright's gaze fell finally upon Miss Pritchard. And the child, of course, has demonstrated remarkable composure. Her actions were precise, considerate, and entirely in accordance with social expectation. She serves as a reminder that observation, discipline, and etiquette often yield more insight than speculation or accusation. He stepped back, allowing silence to fill the hall. In conclusion, he said, the incidents were trivial, yet instructive. They reveal the patterns of human behavior in miniature, the minor perturbations that provoke reflection, the careful concealments, and the small gestures that betray truth even as they respect civility. No one acted with malice, yet through observation, subtle inconsistencies, and attentive attention, we have discerned the natural order behind apparent disorder. The assembly, quiet and contemplative, seemed to absorb the logic of the inspector's explanation. The tension ebbed, replaced by a collective understanding of the delicate interplay of human action and social expectation. Purbright allowed himself a faint smile, noting the gentle shifts in demeanour, the relaxation of posture, and the return to calm civility. The pattern, once obscure, was now revealed in its entirety with clarity and precision. As he gathered his notes and prepared to leave, the sunlight on the polished floor caught the faint traces of previous disturbances, the smudge on the ribbon, the mark of the vase, and the subtle crease in the letters. All remained as silent testimony to the intricacy of human behaviour, quietly illuminating what words alone could not. Flaxborough would return to its routine, as it always did, but now with the gentle understanding that even minor incidents carry meaning, and that the truth, while patient, reveals itself to those who watch closely. The morning after the reveal, Flaxborough awoke to a town that was outwardly unchanged. The cobblestones gleamed with recent rain, the bakers' ovens exhaled warmth into the narrow streets, and the soft clatter of shop shutters heralded the opening of another day. Yet beneath this ordinary surface, subtle shifts in behaviour and perception lingered, remnants of the flower show incidents and the careful resolution orchestrated by Inspector Purbright. The townspeople moved with a renewed attentiveness, a quiet awareness that even trivial actions were observed and noted. Mrs. Pettigrew, for example, continued her sharp commentary on proper conduct, but with a gentler tone. She now tempered her indignation with reflection, aware that minor disturbances were seldom intentional. Mr. Carrington, relieved of undue suspicion, carried himself with composed civility, though a faint shadow of self-consciousness remained when children or small accidents drew attention. Pomeroy, similarly exonerated, resumed his meticulous work at the council office, his movements precise yet relaxed, as though he had shed a weight of social expectation. Miss Pritchard, the child whose conduct had so subtly guided the course of events, returned to her routines with quiet poise. She continued to observe, to participate, and to interact with a deliberateness that seemed almost rehearsed, though entirely natural. The adults, now aware of the small influence of her actions, regarded her with a mixture of amusement and respect. Purbright, for his part, settled into the familiar rhythm of paperwork and quiet reflection. He reviewed his notes on the wine, the vase, the smudged ribbon, and the shuffled letters, each trivial element now contextualized within the broader pattern of human behavior. The town's reactions, the subtle perturbations, and the minor displays of concealment all had their place in the tapestry he had observed and recorded. Even the constables, initially eager to attribute blame to Mr. Pomeroy, had learned a quiet lesson in observation, patience, and the limitations of superficial evidence. They moved through their duties with increased care, noting subtleties in tone, gesture, and hesitation that might otherwise have escaped attention. Flaxborough, in its outward routine, continued undisturbed. The post office opened its doors, the market bustled with measured chatter, and the tea shops served tea with habitual precision. Yet those who had been touched, however subtly, by the week's events, now carried a private awareness of human complexity, of the gentle interplay of civility and curiosity, and of the ways that minor disruptions illuminate hidden motives. Purbright walked the streets one final time before returning to his office, noting with satisfaction the quiet order of the town. He had watched, listened, and allowed the patterns to reveal themselves, guiding him to the truth not with confrontation, but through patient, precise observation. Human behavior, he reflected, was at once predictable and endlessly nuanced, a puzzle whose solution required no force, only attention and understanding. He returned to his desk, the late afternoon sun falling across the pages of his notes. With a final review, he set his pen aside. The town's routines continued outside, each citizen resuming their small concerns and minor ambitions, unaware of the careful scrutiny that had revealed the deeper order beneath trivial events. Inspector Purbright allowed himself a faint smile. Another case resolved, not with spectacle or drama, but with the calm precision that had long been his method. Flaxborough would persist in its quiet routines, as it always did, and the lessons of the past week would linger subtly in its air, observable only to those who watched closely. And as he prepared for the evening, tea cooled beside him, and notes neatly filed, Purbright reflected on the town's enduring capacity for civility, observation, and the quiet revelation of truth. The minor mysteries, the trivial disturbances, and the human behaviors they exposed had all been gently illuminated, leaving Flaxborough calm, orderly, and subtly wiser.